I'm absolutely delighted to be presenting with Dr. Ian Brodie today, professor at Cape Breton University. The title for our paper is Nach coltach mhaighstir-sgoil, which is from the same in English there. Don't he look just like the school teacher? A line, the punchline of the tale that we'll be finishing off talking about. And without further ado, I'll let Ian take it away.
Thank you, Tiber. I'm just sort of good here to put this in context and introduce you to Arthur Huff Falzett. He's a fascinating character in the history of folklore. He was the first African-American to receive, I believe, an MA in folklore, and he's certainly the first to get eventually his PhD in anthropology. His PhD work became Black Gods of the Metropolis, Negro Religious Cults of the Urban North, and he's an influential figure in religious studies and urban vernacular religious movements. But prior to this, he was a school teacher in Philadelphia, and he was taking courses with Frank Speck in the mid-1920s. He was taking a night course in anthropology. And Speck said, we're going to have a distinguished visitor coming in the next week, and it's Elsie Clews-Parsons, the eminent folklorist and philanthropist, we should say, who floated the American Folklore Society for a number of years based on her largesse. Anyway, so Elsie Clews-Parsons is coming to Frank Speck's class, and Speck pulls Falzett aside and says she is also interested in engaging a Black student who can come and be a research assistant for her because she's interested in the folklore of the African Nova Scotian population. And no one had ever collected from this group before, and she thought it would be both appropriate and also convenient to have an African-American do so. So she comes to the class, she gives a talk, she talks to Arthur afterwards, and he is very keen to do this. It's work, it's a trip, it's all very well and good. She says, have you ever collected folklore before? He says, no. So she gives him a crash course, and he goes into his neighborhood in Philadelphia and collects a lot from the South Carolina migrant Black community that he was engaged with because he taught there. He was a school teacher, and so he knew this community. That was published in Journal of American Folklore as well. And anyway, in July of 1923, they set off for this trip to Nova Scotia. And he is in her shadow as she starts to encounter people in Yarmouth and the African Nova Scotian community there. And it has some fascinating things to say. For one thing, she's about to, in the middle of the night, go off into the woods with someone. Aren't you afraid to go far into the backwoods alone with unknown characters during the night? I asked. She smiled simply. Her only answer was, this is Canada, not the United States. With British law and control, one doesn't have to fear a thing. But it was not simply British law on which she depended, I was certain. It was also on her own intuition and the very clear presence of the force of her own spirit and personality that she depended, a force that made her confident she had a protective sheath about her. That's from a letter that Falzett wrote in 1970 to Peter Hare, who was doing a biography of Parsons at the time. We don't have a huge amount of data about Falzett and his fieldwork trip specifically, apart from passing references in the Cleuson's in the Parsons archive that's available through the American Philosophical Society. In part because Falzett was also a figure in the Harlem Renaissance, and I believe he imagined his legacy most importantly to be literary. He had relatives who were larger figures in the Harlem Renaissance, and so even though he has this incredibly important role to play in folklore and in anthropology and in religious studies, he thought himself more than anything a writer, and perhaps a frustrated writer at that. So so he's one of those missing folklorists, and he should be probably brought into the pantheon of folklorists of color. And one of the things that he collected, the work that he did in Nova Scotia eventually became Folklore from Nova Scotia, which was a memoir of the American Folklore Society, and it's almost exclusively from the African American population. And that is the source of the text that Tiber will be investigating and discussing as we go along. So, yes. Tiber.
Oh, thanks, Ian. Yeah, I mean, I was just so interested. I remember when we were first chatting about the work, and you mentioned that there were a few storytellers in the collection that were Scottish Gaelic speakers. And I said, but were there any texts recorded in Gaelic? And you said, yeah, I think there is one. And then I went on and found the PDF of the folklore from Nova Scotia, and there was one that was taken down that that I'd like to finish the talk looking at. But just in general, why this is so important. When they arrived in July of 1923 in Yarmouth, this was there had not been any trained folklorists doing field work anywhere among the Scottish Gaelic speaking population of the province, mainland or Cape Breton Island. And so what is remarkable is this early date. When we look at the sound recording archives that we have there, so we have a corpus of folk narrative of material that is very rich, but it does not represent many of what is really special about Falzett's contribution here, although it isn't a very large corpus, is that it represents individuals that are not as represented in the standing corpus that we have, where the majority of the stories that we have from Gaelic-speaking storytellers in Nova Scotia is from rural, predominantly Roman Catholic, white storytellers that are living as farmers, and in the case of Falzett's work, with just the sort of half a dozen narratives that can be traced back to his and Parsons' work with various storytellers who had Gaelic as a first language, both storytellers that were people of color as well as of white Scottish descent, as both, is that so we have intersections in this way that are not represented in our large corpus. And what's remarkable is that in 1864, right after the last volume of the Popular Tales of the Highlands comes out, John Francis Campbell goes on what he calls his American tramp in the fall of 1864, and goes to Sydney, Cape Breton, says, hi, I'm meeting with Gaelic speakers here. I recognize their dialects. I see memories of intergenerational transmission of vernacular architecture, like rounded end stone buildings that are being used. He's saying all this very interesting material. He comments on Gaelic speakers living in close proximity with people of other European background and African Nova Scotian background, but we get nothing of a folk narrative. So with all that potential in 1864, we get a little bit of a description from Falzett about what his intent was, and he comments, in some regions of Nova Scotia, Scotch Gaelic is spoken. Here one comes upon tales in Gaelic. I recorded several of these and one or two in the original Gaelic. A person of French descent may tell you that a story about the adventures of Jacques. Persons of English descent will talk about Jack, and an Irishman may relate old superstitions such as the leprechaun legends. So that is to say, the lore is heterogeneous. None of it is the property of any one particular group, but he adds the caveat with the possible exception of the Gaelic tales. So in looking at this, he was very interested in finding both Gaelic and French-speaking African Nova Scotian storytellers, and we get descriptions of him going to individuals like Professor Angus MacDonald, who I think might have been Angus L. MacDonald. Can you scout out, are there any, and there's always been this lore of stories about other ethnic groups speaking Scottish Gaelic in places like Antigonish and New Glasgow and Pictou, where you have a lot more diversity among the population, but everything was sort of anecdotal. I knew this guy that spoke Gaelic, and Falzett's like, where is he? I'd love to meet him. And he's off in Newfoundland. Or I know another African Nova Scotian that spoke Gaelic, but he's been dead for years. So we get this this desire on Falzett's behalf to document these traditions in other languages that are being maintained by African Nova Scotians actively, but not finding any of that data. So the story that we have is actually from us. We'll be talking about is from a white storyteller, but in mainland Nova Scotia. But in the case of Parsons, she did find African Nova Scotians who told stories in Scottish Gaelic, and he describes that clues Parsons found several in Waikagama, but these will always be, I suspect, persons who have been reared as individuals among groups where Gaelic or French was the mother tongue. So when we look at the corpus of stories that we have of the international tale types, the Merchen, that were documented by this collaboration between Falzett and Parsons, there are 5 stories in total that can be definitively traced back to Scottish Gaelic speaking storytellers. We only have one text in Gaelic, and that was, and we will talk about that a bit more in a moment. But one of the more remarkable storytellers that we have described was George Maxwell, who was the son of George Maxwell, who came to Nova Scotia as a young man, as a child, really, on a ship, and an O'Hanley who was at the ship getting potatoes that were being unloaded, according to family tradition, adopted him and took him back to the community of Judic, Inverness County, where he was raised as part of the family as a mother tongue Gaelic speaker. I mean, and this isn't a one-off. I mean, when we think about storytellers that we sort of take for granted, like Joan Neal McNeill, just because of their skin color, we don't always remember he was also adopted into the Middle Cape community and was not ethnically from a Scottish Gaelic speaking community, but was adopted by an older couple, and came to be the representative of one of the best Scottish Gaelic storytellers that we have on either side of the Atlantic at the end of the 20th century, represented in the fieldwork of John Shaw. So we get an interesting description in the text of the informants in Folklore from Nova Scotia. There's 3 individuals listed: George Maxwell, Margaret Maxwell Jr., who is George's daughter, and Colin Maxwell. And those are informants 57, 58, and 59. And Colin Macmillan is the last one. And what is interesting is that when we look at Fawcett's notes from the American Philosophical Society, you also get another informant added as in her list. This would be George was 12, and then a 12A, Margaret Maxwell, and I'm not sure the first name was taken accurately by Parsons at the time, but we have the description here: wife of George Maxwell, colored, speaker of Scottish Gaelic, and their daughter Margaret, who contributed some material as well. And listed right next to them is a neighbor, Colin Macmillan. George had a son later, also named George. So this is George III. Was interviewed, and the oral history appears in Cape Breton's magazine number 28, which appeared in June of '81. Said, "My grandfather spoke Gaelic. I don't imagine he had very much of any language when he came to Halifax." So this is the first George. "And up there in Judic, you had to learn Gaelic to get along. And my mother and father never spoke any English in the house." So he's talking about his mother and father, who were visited by Elsie Clews Parsons. "When they spoke to each other, they always spoke Gaelic," he said. "So I picked it up. I couldn't tell a big story in Gaelic, but I'm guessing because he's saying that his father could, but I can talk and I know what someone's telling me. My father would tell stories in Gaelic." So we can only imagine, if Elsie Clews Parsons had Scottish Gaelic, the repertoire that she could have recorded from this African Nova Scotian Gaelic speaking storyteller, George Maxwell's father, George, in the visit in 23. But what we do get are stories that are represented in the corpus of the popular tale types. So if we look at the ones that were collected, we have, and those were republished also in the Cape Breton's magazine article. There was a variant of ATU 956B, The Clever Maiden Alone at Home Kills the Robbers, which you get a sense that he almost brings himself into it. There's a description of the sailor and the cook on the vessel there. And he said he heard it in Gaelic from Sandy Gillis, a white man of Southside Black River, West Bay, 18 miles from Waikagama. And so we get a sense of a storyteller that passed these stories on, and you start to get in these snatches of description in the notes, a sense of the lines of transmission. If only we had further data, it would be absolutely tremendous. We get another version of The Grateful Dead with a bit of the Magic Flight episode of ATU 13 being told by him as well. And then from his neighbor, Colin Macmillan, we get a version of ATU 563, The Table, the Ass, and the Stick. And all 3 of these types are coming from a Presbyterian community, which is it's unusual for Presbyterian communities to have these types of stories, these international folk tales being documented. We have very little material on that from the Nova Scotian Gaelic context. And even more remarkably, in many ways, is that it's not said here but you can see when we look up at the 1921 Canadian census, where you see both George and George Maxwell and all the members of his family and Colin were neighbors of one another. So it wasn't being explicitly told, but you get the sense that there was a social world that wasn't entirely captured in the notes that Falzett or Parsons gives us on these storytellers. So it just leaves us asking more about what the situation was. But if these stories are being told, if Parsons is visiting, she might have visited with George Maxwell, and George said, my neighbor Colin tells a lot of good stories too. He's got some of the ones you're looking for, and sending her on there. But we don't have, unfortunately, Parsons' notes on those exchanges. It's interesting to see these stories from a perspective of a different social world that existed in the Presbyterian Gaelic-speaking communities in Cape Breton Island at this time, which would have had more literacy as well. So that is leading us to our next discussion, which is the Gaelic text. We have an English telling of a story and a Gaelic telling of a story, one right after the other, recorded by Falzett. It's a version of a tale type that is not very well represented in the Gaelic languages, both Irish and Scottish Gaelic, on either side of the Atlantic. What we get here is it's from informant 40, who we'll talk about in a moment, Ebenezer McMillan, who's from a mining community just outside of New Glasgow, Westville, and was a miner himself when we look him up on the census. And then we get another version right after it of and Nach agus an Shoalatar, the farmer and the sailor is the title given in Gaelic. It's called The Interrupted Dinner in English, and it says dictated by informant 89 and copied by informant 90, and we don't get anyone really past, I think, if I'm remembering it right, 75 in the list of informants from Falzett. So we have no idea who these people are, but the story in Gaelic is essentially the same. We can tell that because it's missing one of the three components of well, if we look at the tale type 1358C, trickster discovers adultery, there's usually a sort of sham magician that uses an instrument to both make sure that the husband, who doesn't know any better, gets access to his supper that was being fed to a paramour, and it usually involves food, a good drink, and then at the end, the outing of the paramour from usually being hiding in a cupboard or a chest or something in the house. And in our instance, it's a compass that's doing that. In the two versions from Falzett that he got from Ebenezer McMillan, we only get a bottle of brandy and the husband who is of course being told that the devil is in this house, and that's where we get the lovely punchline. So we know these stories are old. I mean, Thompson commented on how the stories about seduction and adultery, the Fableau, the Novelle, the Novelle, the jest books are all early literary traditions. So it's really unusual. We don't, as I said, don't have a lot of these in the oral tradition. And so when I was thinking about it, I said, I've gone a lot through the newspaper Mhaighstir in my research, and I vaguely remembered something that seemed a lot like this story. And sure enough, when I started typing in keywords, brandy, compass, browndy, compassja, Shoalatar, Tuanach, all the words, brandy, compass, a sailor, a farmer, I found a version of the story published in Mhaighstir, which was the longest running Gaelic newspaper ever on either side of the Atlantic, published by Jonathan G. McKinnon from Waikagama, but out of his printing shop in Sydney. And we get in it this story, Bjar lesh nach Danike, which is the title would mean it would have been better for him had he not come at all. And that was published on the 18th of February in 1898. And what's interesting about this is that we do have anecdotes about this newspaper. So literacy and provisions for education in Gaelic was it was not universal. Some of the few communities that would have it literacy would be through worship in the language and reading of the Bible in the language, and that would have been the Presbyterian communities. So we have that would have been one of the few places. So in the traditions that we have in the sound recordings, we have more of that oral Roman Catholic tradition being represented. But what Mhaighstir was able to go into either community, because if you had one member of the community that taught themselves to read Gaelic or had knowledge of it in the family. But we get a sense literacy is there. But so there's individuals that could go into a house with a copy of the paper and then read it out loud, and then it would enter into the oral tradition. So I think the versions that we're looking at are quite short that Falzett recorded. The one in Mhaighstir is over 2,000 words. It has all 3 points in it: the food, the brandy, the devil, who turns out to be the schoolmaster. And the schoolmaster is the punchline, of course, again, in the 2 versions, both English and Gaelic from Falzett. And it's just a remarkable bit of evidence that I think might suggest that this story was enjoyed wherever the paper landed, and perhaps this Ebenezer Macmillan might have heard it being recited, at one point in his own life. He might have been literate and had a copy of it himself, and perhaps that's how we got the story that Falzett published. I don't know if I should have told the story in it, but we're a little tight on time there. But I suggest getting out the folklore from Nova Scotia. Just in glancing at, there's so many. I think there's so much potential for further interesting research when we look at the census data, the diversity of the storytellers that are being recorded. One of the first informants they met, Basil, I think it's Robinson in Yarmouth. It had family in that worked in Boston that were both of African background and Japanese, and there's some interesting ghost stories there that his father tells there. So there's a lot of work that can still, I think, be gleaned from it. I'm looking at the Irish sources of the stories there, and a lot of them I think fit into some of the ones Sean O'Sullivan did a study on them, looking at religious tales in the Irish tradition. So I think there's plenty of future research that can come out of this.
Yeah, I think one of the, just sort of summing up, I think one of the interesting things about Falzett's work is something that he sort of positions in his introduction to it, basically that you would expect that the African Nova Scotian community would basically have this stories from the old world and continue this notion of that their folklore would be almost indistinguishable from the African American folklore of Brer Rabbit. He said basically that is non-existent. The older people will go, "Oh, I vaguely remember that." And he describes one person, and he describes it in this literary style because he imagined himself a writer. And I think it's a good thing to read him not simply as a source, but read him as an author, because he's quite evocative in his stages. But one person is he describes them as sweating as they're trying to reconstruct a Brer Rabbit story.
Right.
But
so maybe it was in the newspaper a couple decades earlier.
Yeah, exactly. But one of the reasons why it is so is probably a neglected text is that it doesn't fit into the canon of cross North America African diasporic lore, because it is such an outlier. But rather, I think one of the things that Tiber is suggesting, and I'm suggesting, is that look at it because it's syncretic, because it's complicated, because it's an outlier, and then really dig down. And granted, with the limitations of how it was recorded in the 1920s, and with the limitations of what we don't know in terms of all the background that came into its and how it came to be compiled, nevertheless, it becomes this opportunity and this invitation to take these networks more and more seriously as vibrant, syncretic, creative communities that existed in the 20th century with newspapers, and radio wouldn't have happened then, I know for a fact, but the beginnings of these networks. Yeah. So I think that's one of the reasons that we wanted to talk about this today.
It is that what most certainly the earliest text that we have appearing in the work of a trained folklorist in Scottish Gaelic from the province of Nova Scotia.
And therefore, go look at it.
Yeah.
So thank you very much. And I guess we'll turn the video off and we'll start answering questions.
Okay, wonderful.